1% of dudes rapping, they ain't nice as me. 98% ain't live the same type of life as me. The judge gave me life and then they sent me where the life is be. That level 4 with depth and vice, the type of stuff they like to see. Two choices, fight or flee. I refuse to die a chump. I never been a mark, but damn, it's scary when that riot jump. I seen dudes cry, get pumped, and some sexually brutalized. Knew a dude who lost his life and he was only doing 5 year-long racial fights when homie all you do is ride. Lonely days and nights up in a hole causing suicide. From the moment you arrive, you see the Mexican mafia, AB skinheads with big giant swastikas, pro-black philosophers, the BGF, the Kumi, and Muslims who will murk you from the nation to the Sunni. That MS was loony, quick to ride up on they rival. Even Christians went to church, hide knives up in they Bible. Political and tribal, the Crips and Damus, the Long Beach, the Hubs and the Dubs and the Grooves, the IE, the Bakersfield, the Dago Pyrus, the Hustlers quick to roll, the gangsters don't move, whatever.
So I often have a lot of individuals ask me, hey, Chill, man, when you was in prison, did the BGF still have a stronghold on the blacks? And most definitely not. By the time I got to prison, which was in 1996, a lot had changed with a lot of the quote unquote big four groups, you know. And so let me give you guys a little information on all that stuff and what pretty much made the, you know, BGF somewhat go underground, right? At some point in time, California Department of Corrections, also known as CDCR, they started giving dudes a indeterminate SHU program, and the SHU is an acronym for Segregating Housing Units. CDCR started basically coming up with this framework saying that if they could prove an individual was a part of a prison gang, not a street gang like the Crips or the Bloods or what have you, but a prison gang, a gang that was specifically formed in prison like the BGF and other structures that were formed in prison, then they could validate you as a prison gang member and give you a indeterminate SHU. And so that sort of forced a lot of individuals, you know, who was part of that BGF structure to either get validated or go somewhat underground, right? And so let me give you a little background on the indeterminate SHU, right? And I'm not going to be maybe as accurate as others who have been validated and went through that process, right? I know a little bit about it though. So basically it was really an unfair process, right? Because they started, you know, saying they had some points, right? They had I believe they had to have three independent sources, right, of evidence to say that an individual was part of a prison gang. And I think they had to have something like 10 points or something like that, right? And so some of the ways that you could get these points or whatever is like if you had a certain type of art, if you had pictures of maybe you and an individual who had already been validated, if you had associates who was, you know, in these organizations, maybe if they caught you with certain type of literature or reading material, and of course from prison informants. Right now, all this was a system that was very hard to fight because it was something that would not be reviewed and overlooked by the court. It was a classification committee, you know, and the classification committee is just made up of individuals who work for CDCR. So of course, you know, you got counselors, you got, you know, level 2 counselors, and a lot of these individuals are gonna be just people who were former guards. You know, you got lieutenants and stuff and captains on these classification committees. So it's pretty much like it's really a kangaroo court, and it's unfair because there is really no legal review per se to overlook all these things. This is some in-house, you know, basically like a kangaroo court going on pretty much, right? And so when you did have convicts challenge this stuff through legal writs in the early 80s, but especially like around 87, you know, 88, you know, and then of course in 89 too, when Pelican Bay opened, right, you would have individuals who would challenge these unlawful placements in the SHU, because once again, an indeterminate SHU is basically saying, man, you are going to be there indefinitely. There is no time period of when we will allow you out. And so the courts basically rude pretty much with the California Department of Corrections and doing these things, because the prison system in California, they framed all that stuff. They said, hey man, we're not sending these people to the hole as a punitive punishment. It's administration, basically, which means it's prison management. We're not sending them to the hole because of something that they done. We're sending them to the hole because of who they are and because they pose a risk to the safety of the institution, right? And so by using those words, when the court agreed with that, then they can say, okay, well, you know what? We reviewed this individual and he still poses as a threat, and so the only way pretty much to come from under that threat was to debrief. You had to brief, you had to incriminate yourself, you had to incriminate others and give information on, the workings of that structure. And so that's the reason why you had a lot of individuals who set up in the hole, 10, 15, 20 years, and so say you got sentenced to an indeterminate shoe because of your affiliation to one of these prison gangs. And then you paroled from that sentence. 2 years later, you come back on another sentence. They would send you right back to the hole, and so the situation, like I said, man, it was extremely unfair. There was no jury who would review this stuff. There was no court sentence or nothing. So, you wouldn't get a Eighth Amendment review, and an Eighth Amendment is basically an abuse of power or an unfair sentence or something like that, and so it was totally unfair. And so by the get down that the prisons was working with, they could keep these people in prison, in the hole indefinitely, right? And so due to that, like I said, then you had a lot of individuals who either got validated or they went underground. They wouldn't have certain type of markings, association, pictures of other dudes in the BGF with them, right? So by the time I got to prison in 96, all this stuff was well in place, right? And so you didn't see dudes out in the open, publicly claiming to be part of the BGF because, of course, once again, it could get them validated, right? A lot of people see BGF as a up northern movement, right? And you definitely had more members from the BGF who was from up north than down south. But there was a time in the California Department of Corrections and in the prisons where you had a lot of dudes from down south as well who were BGF, right? I ran across a homie who happened to be from the Inland Empire, an older homie, of course, in 2005, I believe, 2004, somewhere up in there. And he was BGF, but he wasn't going around letting individuals know, right? And so then there's always this too. Like I said, especially by the time I got to prison, right? You had a lot of individuals assume that the BGFs were individuals from up north. And once you started having a heavy influx of Crips and Bloods hit the California Department of Corrections, you did have the BGF pretty much be a up north thing. And so, of course, by me being from down south, that wasn't information that I was privy to of who was or who wasn't BGF, right? So in a nutshell, what I'm trying to say is by me not functioning with that structure, I really didn't know who was who. You would see dudes from up north and just think, hey man, they're up north dudes, not necessarily knowing what they function as, right? Because for the most part, dudes from up north didn't necessarily hang with dudes from down south, right? For those who are not from California, Northern California and Southern California in relation to black, culture is very, very different, worlds apart. Oakland is one of the few cities, period, not necessarily in California, but in the United States that does not have Crips and Bloods. There are no Crips and Bloods gangs in Oakland right now. Of course, you may have a Crip move up there from LA or move up there from wherever, right? But I'm talking about gangs that are formed and started in Oakland, right? Oakland does its own thing, right? So by there not being any Crips and Bloods in Oakland, it's just very, very different. And so when in prison, the dudes from up north, they hung with the dudes from up north, and the dudes from down south, they hung with the dudes from down south, right? Now, you do have cities up north in Northern California who have embraced the Crip and Blood culture, but not in the city of Oakland, right? And so a lot of times, right, when I had interactions with dudes from up north, it may happen to be because we had a mutual, hobby that we liked or shared, either rapping or we play basketball, and you get to talking to an individual and things like that, right? So you didn't really know who was who, because once again, you didn't function with that structure, and dudes was no longer outwardly representing themselves as this or that. For a long time myself, I thought that BGF was, just something that everybody from Oakland participated in, right? But it wasn't until maybe, I want to say around 2005, right? I became extremely close with a dude from up north. I'm not gonna put his name out there right in this video right here, but we was extremely close, right? And so come to find out, he didn't mess with the BGF. He didn't like any part of what that was about, and he didn't function with it. And I assumed that all those dudes fell up under that that umbrella or whatever. And so he was cool, but it was a trip, because by him being from up north, from Oakland, he was also extremely interested in the California culture. He was one of those individuals, man, who messed with a whole lot of dudes from California. He messed with a whole lot of Crips and Bloods, right? And so he didn't have a problem with him. One time, man, I ended up going to the hole, right? And as I'm in the hole, this is in corporate. I'm in the hole corporate. I don't have a celly. So they asked me, hey, man, we got some stuff going on here. A riot had jumped off on another yard, and we need to consolidate a lot of people. Are you willing to take a celly or whatever? And I said, it all depends on who he is. So they brought me out to talk to this one dude, man, and the dude asked me where I was from, and I told him. He said, oh, no, man, you know what, I'm not going to go in the cell with you. I said, oh, I'm not tripping. He was from up north. He said, no, I don't want to start nothing back here that I wouldn't do on the main line. Basically saying that he didn't want to go in the cell with me because of my affiliation and what gang I represented and so on and so forth, right? So you've always heard that dudes from up north, in prison at least, don't like, Crips from down south or whatever the case was, right? And so, like I said, he was unwilling to come in the cell with me, right? But my partner from Oakland, he was very interested in the Crip and Blood culture, and as I was interested in the Oakland culture. So we would sit there, man, and we, like I said, we became extremely close and cool. And so we were talking. He would ask me simple questions about gang banging and things that was going on down south that, to me, any Crip or Blood would know, because it was very elementary, right? But to him, being from Oakland, it made no sense to him or whatever. I remember at that time, the rapper The Game, he was out, right? And so there were certain things in his, in some of the songs that he would say, and he would ask me, hey, chill, man, what does this mean right here? What does he mean right here when he's saying this, when he's saying that, because once again, the cultures are extremely different. And I would ask him a lot of questions about Oakland and so on and so forth. And he would just tell me about all the things going on up there, and our cultures was extremely different, right? So once again, he let me know that, he didn't support, or function with dudes who were BGF and things of that nature. He done his own thing, him and his homies, right? He kind of looked at, hopping into BGF sometimes, how you have individuals from down south who look at, going to prison and joining, Crip paperwork or getting up under Blood paperwork. They call it being cut. You have some individuals who feel, man, that's not something I want to do. They would talk down on being cut, and so on and so forth. And so his feelings on joining the BGF was similar to that, right? And so, like I said, man, we got cool, and we talked a whole lot, and he just shared a lot of information with me about things that go on in Oakland, right? And so, the BGF definitely did not have a stronghold on the black population. They had no influence whatsoever on the entire black population. Of course, you know, by the time I hit prison, everything was united in terms of up north, down south brothers or whatever. So of course they had no influence over what Crips and Bloods did, and so on and so forth. And like I said, due to the indeterminate shoe and all that type of stuff, you know, it was very rare to even run across an individual that would outright tell you, yeah, man, you know, I'm BGF. You had to be, you know, you had to be real cool with an individual for him to share that information, you know, with you, and so on and so forth. So now what the BGF did amongst their people and dudes from up north, once again, I have no idea of because I did not function within that structure. So I can't say, you know, how much of an influence they was over their people or so on and so forth, right? So that's my story right there. You know, I did see, and I might do a reaction to it, right? I did see an individual a while ago. He gave his reaction, and he claimed to be from up north and of that structure. He gave his reaction to the situation when Yogi was killed in whatever prison that he was killed in, right? And so he spoke on that situation, and you know, I believe he, you know, claimed to be a part of that structure, and spoke on the inner workings and situations surrounding that. So you know, according to him, you know, that structure was still, you know, was still going, which was still strong and going. But like I said, you know, it's not something that they, you know, just let everybody know about, man. So anyway, you already know what it is. It's your boy 16 to life. Resume normal program.